Until the mid-19th century, the Church of Scotland carried out vital registration through the parish kirk sessions, local ecclesiastical courts comprising the parish minister, a number of male elders chosen by the congregation, and a session clerk. The session clerk was supposed to record every baptism, burial, and proclamation of marriage bans in the parish register book, but in practice, the quality and regularity of these volumes varied greatly. Many parishes made only sporadic entries or kept no register at all. The session clerks generally expected a payment from every person coming to register a vital event, which discouraged poorer people from doing so. But even where no fee was charged, the poor seldom bothered with registration because, having no rich friends to leave them money and property, they saw no need for documentary proof of their marriages or the births of their children. Furthermore, as the Church of Scotland kept the registers, religious dissenters often refused to enter their vital events on principle. This problem was magnified by the Great Disruption of 1843, when almost half the members of the Church of Scotland seceded to found a new, free church. Little wonder, then, that by the 1830s and 40s, not only the government, but also medical practitioners, municipal authorities, and statistical societies lamented the patchy nature of Scotland's vital statistics. In England and Wales, the growing demand for complete and accurate records of births, deaths, and marriages to prove inheritance rights resulted in the Registration and Marriage Acts of 1836, which ushered in a new era of registration conducted by civil rather than ecclesiastical authorities. However, equivalent legislation for Scotland proved extremely difficult to achieve, and no fewer than 8 Scottish civil registration bills were introduced between 1829 and 1849. Although the Scots broadly supported the idea of civil registration, certain aspects of these 8 bills proved so objectionable as to halt their passage through Parliament. Firstly, concerns were voiced about the financial and administrative implications of a new civil registration system. Each of the bills proposed the creation of a General Register Office in Edinburgh, staffed by a Registrar General, a Secretary, and various clerks, and also required a local registrar in each of Scotland's 1,058 parishes, who would be paid either through local taxation or from fees charged to the public for recording vital events. The Church of Scotland insisted that such a vast and expensive administration was unnecessary, and that the existing system of registration under the session clerks could work perfectly well if legislation were brought in to standardise it. The Earl of Eglinton similarly objected to, quote, the great number of officers to be appointed, which could scarcely be calculated at less than 2,000, when the present machinery would be quite sufficient for the purpose. Other commentators feared that the cumulative expense of civil registration would far exceed the government's estimate of £10,000 a year. The prospect of forcing rich and poor alike to pay to have their births, deaths, and marriages recorded proved equally contentious. The bills of 1834 and 1835 specified a fixed fee for every event registered, from which the registrars would be paid. That this should meet with hostility was hardly surprising, given the perception that existing fees to the session clerks for recording baptisms, burials, and bans of marriage had led the poor to neglect vital registration. The bills of 1837 and 1847 stipulated that the registrar's wages should instead come out of the parish assessment for the support of the poor, but this was received no more warmly, as both the Scottish press and the parishes feared that it would create a precedent for diverting the poor's money to other purposes. The Lord Advocate, who controlled Scottish parliamentary business and helped to draw up each of the registration bills, explained that he really intended to have a separate local rate for the payment of the registrars, raised in the same manner as the poor rate, but kept distinct from it. But while this appeased the newspapers, the Edinburgh municipal authorities maintained that, as the registration system was a public measure, not a parochial one, it should be funded entirely by the government. Thirdly, the bill's provisions for appointing civil registrars irritated both the established church, which was determined to protect its session clerks' existing income from recording vital events, and the Free Church. The first two bills nominated the parish schoolmasters to be registrars, which the Church of Scotland approved of in small rural parishes, where the same man generally acted as both schoolmaster and session clerk. However, in the towns, these two offices were usually separate, meaning that the duty of registration and the all-important registration fees would effectively be removed from urban session clerks. This the established church could not accept. Nor were the provisions acceptable to the Free Church, which wanted its own session clerks to be eligible for appointment as registrars. More problematically, the Bill of 1847 attempted to exclude all schoolmasters from the post of registrar, as the new Lord Advocate believed this job would interfere too much with their teaching duties. The schoolmasters cum session clerks of Scotland collectively petitioned against this in March 1847. Encouraged by the Church of Scotland, many session clerks also sent individual petitions, pointing out that well-qualified men were usually only attracted to the post of schoolmaster because of its association with that of session clerk and the income derived from recording vital events. Besides this, the schoolmaster was frequently the only person in the parish capable of acting as registrar. In the face of such vehement opposition, the Bills of 1848 and 1849 reverted to nominating the Church of Scotland session clerks as registrars, but this merely revived the opposition of the Free Church, whose members viewed it as grossly unfair to their own session clerks and, quote, an insult to the whole dissenters of Scotland. While the disputes over who should serve as registrars undoubtedly helped to stifle the Bills of 1847, 48 and 49, the overwhelming obstacle against these measures was their association with attempts to tighten up the law of marriage. Until the mid-18th century, the sole requirement for marriage under both English and Scottish common law was the consent of the two people involved. Irregular marriage, established by a verbal expression of consent, or a promise of marriage followed by sexual intercourse, was as legally binding as regular marriage, celebrated by a clergyman after the publication of bans in the parish church. In England, Hardwicke's Act of 1783 rendered irregular marriage invalid and stipulated that only weddings conducted publicly in church and preceded either by the publication of bans or the purchase of a licence would now be recognised. But marriage in Scotland remained constituted solely by the mutual exchange of consent. The Lord Advocate of Scotland believed that a Registration Act would be futile without a parallel reform of the marriage law to ensure that all unions, regular and irregular, were properly recorded. His colleague, Lord Campbell, further asserted that the existing law facilitated clandestine, hasty and bigamous unions, especially at the infamous Gretna Green, that it encouraged the seduction of women, and was altogether such that, quote, nobody who had lived a short time in Scotland could know whether he was married or not. Most importantly, the lack of written evidence for irregular marriages made them extremely difficult to prove for inheritance purposes. The marriage bills therefore aimed to assimilate the Scots law to that of England by permitting only two modes of wedlock: regular marriage celebrated by a clergyman following the publication of bans, with the union afterwards registered according to the Registration Bill, and irregular marriage constituted by appearing before the registrar and signing the marriage register. No other form of irregular marriage would henceforth be recognised. These proposals unleashed storms of protest from all over Scotland. Clergy and laity alike protested that to sanction irregular marriage under statute law, as opposed to common law, would place it on an equal footing with the ecclesiastical ceremony, thus devaluing the sacrament of marriage. Lawyers warned that the proposals would irrevocably damage the fundamental principle of Scots marriage law. And opposing politicians insisted that there was no need to change the law, for clandestine and bigamous unions carried such stigma that they were actually of very rare occurrence among native Scots, and most couples who married at Gretna Green came up from the north of England to evade the strictures of the English marriage law. Ultimately, the vigorous opposition to the marriage bills had unfortunate consequences for the associated registration bills. Since the registration and marriage measures were introduced together and publicly viewed as indivisible, to oppose one was to oppose the other. And, as Blackwood's Edinburgh magazine put it, the Registration Bill of 1949 might very possibly have been carried had it stood alone. Scotland finally obtained her own act for the compulsory civil registration of births, deaths and marriages, rather than baptisms, burials and bans, in 1854, at the 9th attempt, and almost 20 years behind England and Wales. The Bill of 1854 succeeded by virtue of dropping most of the proposals that had proved contentious in the past, and by deliberately placating key interest groups. Thus, instead of expensive and expansive new administrative arrangements for overseeing civil registration, the bill economically proposed to locate the General Register Office within the existing Register House, the repository for the property deeds of Scotland, and to appoint its Deputy Clerk Register as Registrar General. Pressure from the Royal College of Physicians of Edinburgh did, however, ensure that, like the General Register Office for England and Wales, that for Scotland secured Treasury money to appoint a medically qualified Superintendent of Statistics to tabulate the births, deaths and marriages recorded by the local registrars. In order not to resurrect disputes over the selection of local registrars, the bill provided that all session clerks holding office when the Registration Act took effect on the 1st of January 1855 would be appointed registrars during their lifetime, but would have no vested rights in the office, could be dismissed for misconduct, and on their death or removal, the parish authorities would be free to appoint successors of their choice. Though the bill did introduce a parochial rate for the payment of registrars, it did not require informants to pay any fees for recording a birth or death, so long as registration was completed within 3 months of the event. Finally, and perhaps decisively, the Bill of 1854 made no parallel attempt to alter the marriage law, experience having shown that, quote, the people of Scotland regarded with jealousy and suspicion any attempt to interfere with a law to which they were so wedded. This meant that the Act could only enforce the registration of regular as opposed to irregular marriages, but as Scottish couples rarely married irregularly at this time, most unions were in fact recorded. The establishment of civil registration in Scotland then was a protracted and undoubtedly a frustrating process, both for the government and for others keen to procure reliable statistical data about the Scottish population. Yet one could argue that the nascent registration system was the better for its long gestation, as the 25-year interval between the first Bill of 1829 and the Act of 1854 afforded opportunities to observe and learn from the positive and negative features of the earlier English and Welsh Act, and to iron out most of the contentious aspects of the proposals for Scotland. And if anybody is interested to discover more, we have a project website, and the URL's on the screen there. Thank you very much for listening.
Okay, Scotland's multiple demographies. Use this, I think, as a way of doing it. Scotland's demography, and Frank will say a bit more than this in the next slot, has long-standing differences from England's, as the slide says, but it is internally, and has been, right back as far as we can go, phenomenally diverse. And instead of trying to write a book on the population history of Scotland, what I'm actually trying to do at the moment is write a book on the population histories of Scotland, trying to pull out these diversities and show how they carry on over long periods of time. And what you're going to get today are some of the first data analysis results from some of the work that I've been doing. I could have talked about a whole range of themes. I'm not going to talk about marriage. I'm not going to talk about the fact that Sutherland in the 1860s had the lowest nuptiality anywhere in Europe, and indeed West Lothian had the highest in the UK. I'm not going to talk under non-marital fertility about the fact that there were parishes in Banffshire and Wigtonshire in the 1860s and 1870s, where a quarter of all births were registered as illegitimate, nor indeed about the fact that now the illegitimacy centre for Scotland, I suppose, if it has one, is Dundee, with something like half of all the births illegitimate. And I'm not going to talk about causes of death, partly because in the chapter that Nick Wright and I wrote in the Registrar General's Annual Review 2 years ago, we talk quite a lot about differences in mortality. So I'm going to try and talk about population density and population change, patterns of migration, and changes in underlying natural increase. That's population density at a civil parish level in 2001. One of the great things we have in Scotland is that the civil parishes have remained pretty constant right back into the 18th century. Mairi talked about the civil parishes, or the parishes, and we can actually therefore, for most of them, look at the populations at every single census. The boundaries change a bit, so the maps, if you look carefully, the map frameworks will change over time, but basically they're pretty similar. And the registration districts created by the Registrar General in 1855 didn't exactly match with the parishes, which is a nuisance because you have to do all sorts of things in order to make them fit, but nonetheless they go on for significant periods of time as well. And what I've been trying to do is to assemble data as far as possible, running right the way across long periods of time on both of these. That's population density at civil parishes in 2001, and I'm particularly interested in the sparse ones. About 2% of the population, 1.7% of the population actually, lives in parishes where the population is less than 5 people per square kilometre. That's about 83,000 people, and it makes up about 46% of the Scottish population, of the Scottish land area. One on the left-hand side is 1801. And actually, it doesn't look as different as you might have thought. People are always talking about how, over the course of the 19th and 20th centuries, there's a bit flood of the population out of the remote areas and clustered into the central belt. Well, actually, I think what's happened is that the sparser areas have become sparser, and the denser areas have become much denser. And actually it happens within the parishes as well. People have moved from what were already sparsely populated bits of parishes into the more densely populated bits, into little villages and things, rather than being scattered about. But actually, they look less dissimilar, I have to say, than I thought they would. So I thought I'd just show it to you. What about, however, the peak population decay? Now, I've got every census from 1801 to 2001. So when do they peak? The colours here go with the rainbow, and you can't see the key on the left-hand side anyway, but because it's covered up by some funny symbol. But basically, red is the earliest, going through to violet as the latest. It goes through the rainbow. And what it actually shows, look at this big chunk here, the red chunk. There, 1801 to 1841. That's kind of classic. If you believe in clearances, that's clearances. But actually, it's by no means a continuous process. Down here in the southwest, the peaks are actually 1851, or every parish in Wigton, more or less. Up in the northeast, it's 1861, 71, 81. So one of my challenges is actually to explain those different rural periods of peak and equally, of course, of decline. Because if you look at the central belt, you run across here, by no means all of them are purple. In fact, on one measure, the population of Glasgow has actually been declining since 1901. And quite a lot of the parishes in the central belt actually go into decline really quite early on. So what about population change? Well, the left-hand side is changes 1901 to 1911. I guess it's broadly what you would expect. That's percentage change per decade. Red is going down on all these subsequent graphs. Green is going up. And broadly speaking, population moving out of the more remote areas of the north-west, the northeast and the borders, into areas of the central belt, but with a few exceptions, mainly the small towns. But 1951 to 1991 is a very different kind of pattern already. That's again parishes, and actually by the period 1951 to 91, a lot of the parishes in the northwest of Scotland are actually starting to see slow population rise. It's not something, as it were, that just has happened very recently. Much of it actually starts in the 60s and 70s. By contrast, some areas, notably the borders, see most of their population decline from their peaks taking place after the Second World War. So again, there are very different patterns in different areas. And if we then go to, this is the same one, 1951 to 91 on the right-hand side. The left-hand side is 1991 to 2008. I could, in theory, do 1991 to 2001, but we've still got a few problems with some of the parishes where there seem to be some interesting inconsistencies, which Duncan McNiven's staff and I are having some interesting discussions about. Arguably, there are some more differences there in the last 10 years, in that 10 years, than any earlier period of time, and I think we need just a little bit more time. And anyway, I can go up to 2008 on the left-hand side. And broadly speaking, what do you get? Population growth in the vast areas of Scotland, other than the towns, the Western Isles, or the islands in general, and a big chunk of the Western Central Belt. So, what's happening? Well, migration is a dominant feature of Scotland's demography. People always moved around a lot. Emigration in Scotland goes back to the 13th century, and on one measure, if you add up all the net emigration since 1830, it can come to a figure as high as 6 million. Since the early 21st century, of course, as we know, this has changed, and Scotland has become overall a net in-migration country. But what about internal migration? Well, the left-hand side is a parish map again, for the 1860s. And the extraordinary thing, I think, about that map is how there is net out migration, they're red or purple, or sort of pinky purple, in virtually every parish in Scotland. There are a few odd exceptions. The green one in the middle of the northeast there, that's actually the Balmoral effect. And you can see odd ones like Oban on the left-hand side there. But broadly speaking, net people moved out in the 1860s. Not a particularly high national emigration decade. It's just that in general, people flooded out of large areas of Scotland almost continuously. And this by county, because unfortunately the Registrar General gave up publishing adequate data at parish level for the registration district level by the early 20th century. It's counties, but it's very much the same effect. There's really only at county level net in-migration in what was admittedly a quite high emigration decade nationally, really only in the mining areas. Virtually everywhere else people are leaving. The mining parishes, Fife, East Lothian, West Lothian, and in the west, and just one or two other places are seeing growth. In most places, you're seeing decline. Between 1951 and 1961, the Registrar General kindly publishes data separately for the boroughs and for the landward areas, in other words, everything that is non-urban. And the left-hand side, it shows, I suppose, what you would expect. Net out migration from virtually all the landward areas, the only exceptions really being the mining counties. The right-hand side is a bit of a fiddle, because what it's actually showing is out-migration or migration in the boroughs within the counties. So it isn't, as it were, the whole counties, it's the boroughs within the counties. And in fact, in the case of Caithness up in the top, it's one borough, because there only was one, but it nevertheless comes out green. But the interesting thing, right through the whole of this period, is that even the urban areas are tending to see net out migration. In fact, the four cities see net out migration virtually continuously from the later 19th century right through in time. So why do their populations... and that's right, and then here we are. This, however, is the 1980s, net in-migration into the vast proportion of rural local authorities. This is what well known, but out-migration basically from the central belt. And this is 2001 to 2008, where again you've got a net in-migration effect in the vast proportion of counties. So, how does population rise if there's all this net migration going on? And there is, of course, some net in-migration to some of the urban areas at some periods, but critically, the towns grow because they have natural increase. And in fact, they tend to have natural increase which is higher than the countryside. The right-hand one here is parish maps again. This is net natural change, difference between births and deaths in the 1860s. Dark green is high. It's over 10 per 1,000 population per year. Pale green is between 5 and 10, and the very pale is 1 to 5. There is, I think, only about one red one on that map, and I think it's a mistake. Virtually everywhere has positive net natural change, but particularly the northeast, the central belt. And when we come to the early 20th century, it's still positive virtually everywhere, but particularly concentrated in the west central belt and also in the northeast. Population is growing because basically there is net natural increase in most of the central belt. And then we come through the 1900s on the left-hand side, we've already seen. This is 2001-05. It's a completely different pattern. There is negative natural increase in virtually the whole of rural Scotland, positive only really in a very small number of counties. The grey is -1 to +1. So, why does it happen? Well, it happens, you get that pattern in rural areas. They're not like the 19th century towns. They're not demographic sinks. It's the age structure which is producing this particular effect. And what I've drawn here is a graph which for 2001 to 2005 shows the crude death rate on the horizontal axis, and doesn't seem to be a key on it, the standardized death rate on the vertical axis. And what you see is exactly the pattern that graph, if you look at the crude death rate, the graph shows roughly what the map showed. Here's the Western Isles, way above the Scottish average, which is the vertical line there, with a crude death rate of over 14, nearly 15. And notice West Lothian over there, I'm sure the local authority, head of the local authority in West Lothian, who I have met, uses this as one of the splendid pieces of thing, a wonderful place West Lothian is. Has the lowest crude death rate, almost the lowest crude death rate in Scotland. The rural areas in general are the green splodges down here. They're all above Scotland, more or less. And the other areas, the black ones, they're the West Central Belt. Now look at it the other way, and the pattern looks completely different. West Lothian, in standardised terms, is way above. The Western Isles is fractionally above, and rather worryingly fractionally above. The rural areas, if once you age standardise, look really rather good. And most of the West Central Belt, above all Glasgow, right at the top, look, as you would expect, absolutely desperate. So I then created, and this causes people a lot of amusement, something which we might call standardised natural increase, or standardised natural change, where you have age standardised death rate across the top. No horizontal axis key on this one either. And they've disappeared in the putting it across. And age standardised birth rate up the left-hand side. What does this mean? Well, I think what it means, actually, it tells you about the behaviour of people. Because what actually the crude death rate tells you about is the behaviour of places. But actually, the people are actually much better reflected in the age standardised than in the crude rates. And what this shows, let's just save time, broadly speaking, zero natural change would be the diagonal. This is age standardised death rates, that's age standardised birth rates. You get, broadly speaking, what you might expect. Here's Glasgow, way down below the diagonal. There are all the rural areas. They look desperate if you look at the crude rates. If you look at the standardised rates, and this is 2001 to 5, let's concentrate on that one over there, they look rather good. The West Central Belt in general is all pretty awful. The rural areas are pretty good. Above all, what is good are the three local authority areas that surround the cities, Aberdeenshire, East Lothian and Angus. And we get this very odd effect of Edinburgh, Aberdeen and Dundee, the red triangles down the bottom, mainly because their fertility is so low. You want to follow up some of the references of things we've already done on that. They're on the slide there, and I shall stop.
Okay, thanks very much. I am actually not going to touch on some very interesting areas that Michael's covered around migration stuff, which possibly in the history of Scotland's health has a very important element, especially, and we're trying to build an understanding of that in some of the work we're doing at St Andrews at the moment. But I'm not going to focus particularly on that as an explanation of Scotland's particularly poor health. And the question I'm going to ask today, given Scotland's particularly poor health record in a European context, is there actually something specific about Scotland that's driving its health? In effect, some risk factor particular to Scotland, if you like. Okay, just to start off with, and this, all my data for the sort of life expectancy comes from the Human Mortality Database, which for comparative research is probably the best, and Scotland's been added very recently, I think, in 2008. Scotland, this is life expectancy at birth for men, and you see similar trends for women, and I apologise that I don't show all, it's just to keep the number of graphs down. But at the bottom we see over time, effectively, we've got England and Wales, Scotland, and we've also put in Sweden and Norway because increasingly people make comparisons and say, wouldn't it be great if Scotland was like our near neighbours in Scandinavia with similar population sizes? And we can see that the Scandinavians do awfully well at living a long time. The English and Wales, on aggregate, do a lot better than Scotland does. And the gap narrowed a bit from the end of the Second World War, but the actual gap between Scotland and England is actually slightly rising a bit. And I apologise for the huge complication on this chart. It should be better presented, but I haven't quite had the time to refine my thoughts because this is coming from some work in progress. But effectively, what this chart is showing is that perhaps before 1977 and the period before, this is England's advantage over Scotland in life expectancy, and this is using a demographies technique of decomposing life expectancy by age to see which age groups are driving the difference. And we can see here that England has slightly in recent years increased its advantage. Before 77, Scotland did pretty well actually in reducing the difference between it and England and Wales in deaths in the first year of life. And actually that is, there is no sort of difference now. And actually the difference now is mainly driven by deaths that occur under 65, with some difference above those. So effectively, often in epidemiology, people talk about 65 or 75 being premature mortality. And a lot of this work, the Scottish difference, Scotland's poorer rates of life expectancy and general health are tended to be driven by their, particularly amongst those people of working age. Okay, so people have always been interested in trying to find out, well, why does the difference exist particularly between Scotland and England and Wales? And famously, Carstairs and Morris in a British Medical Journal paper introduced what became known as the Carstairs score. And basically, this was a frustration with census tables broken down by social class and mortality statistics, in that the social class differences between Scotland and England weren't that great, and thus the feeling was that it wasn't properly and accurately reflecting the level of socioeconomic deprivation. So Carstairs and Morris cleverly used an area-based score of the percentage of people unemployed, people in low social class, no car ownership and overcrowding from the 81 census, and used quite small areas to look at that. And basically they found that once you standardised for deprivation differences between England and Scotland, with Scotland obviously being much more deprived than England, the standard mortality ratio was only 103, and it had been reduced from about 120. So effectively they were finding that you could explain the differences in the mortality rates between Scotland and England by taking account of just by using an area-based deprivation measure. So in 2001 and then again in 2005, Phil Hanlon and colleagues at Glasgow University returned and tried to update Carstairs and Morris's work from 81 to looking whether the continuing difference that we were seeing in 91 and again seeing in the 2001 census, around the 2001 census in mortality rates, differences between Scotland and England, if that could be explained again by this deprivation measure. And basically they found that in the 90s and in 2000 that increasingly the Carstairs score was increasingly ineffective in explaining the difference between Scotland and England, and that from about, perhaps they used a slightly different measures to Carstairs and Morris' original paper, but from about explaining about 60% of the difference, it went to explaining below 50%. And they found particularly that the residual excess that couldn't be explained by taking account of deprivation differences was located in people of working age. And they christened this, or it became christened, the Scottish effect, this residual difference that could not be explained by controlling for differences in deprivation between Scotland and England. And they rightly asked, well, what could this be? Their perhaps favourite suggestion was that there perhaps is some sort of psychosocial explanation, and this probably fitted in with the time, particularly where in health inequalities research, explanations around ideas of stress, which effectively is what people are talking about in psychosocial explanations, that stress was being seen as perhaps a big driver of socioeconomic differences. And they were thinking that perhaps as a regard of Scotland's particular economic situation, or more generally about how Scotland saw itself, that Scotland was in fact facing some sort of crisis of confidence. And this led to particularly poor health amongst its population through perhaps health behaviours or whatever it may be. But this was just a hypothesis and they had little evidence for it. Richard Mitchell in 2005 returned to looking at whether we could find a Scottish effect in something a bit different. Scotland has particularly high levels of heart disease. And he made use of the fact that in Scotland and England, we have health surveys in which they take very detailed survey measures and also blood measures from people. And basically, these surveys are done by the same survey company. So for comparative work, they're very good because they use very similar methods. And they found that when you looked at the difference, and Scotland had a higher rate of self-reported heart disease, they found that once you controlled for loads of factors listed on the board there, including some deprivation measures, some health behaviours, for example, they had things on smoking, drinking, etc. They had measures on blood pressure, cholesterol. They had measures about mental health as well. But they found once you added all these into a model, the odds ratio from the age-adjusted, the age and sex-adjusted, in fact, was only reduced from 1.64 to 1.5. So they were suggesting that this was more evidence for a Scottish effect. There was lots of things that traditional risk factors for heart disease just couldn't explain in the difference between Scotland and England. Okay. So around this time, I sort of became interested. I actually was working with Rich Mitchell at the time, and I was always a bit suspicious. I was a bit suspicious because the idea of a Scottish effect, partly because in epidemiology we're very good in inventing new risk factors. I think some papers calculate there's about 200 risk factors for heart disease so far. So how many of these are actually causal or not is a debatable point. So effectively, I made use of the fact that that increasingly what people were finding in it was that aggregate measures didn't really capture an individual's, even if it was a small area level, individual's sort of deprivation very well. And that also deprivation was not just best captured by one measure, but a range of measures, which had been Carstairs and Morris's original idea. But I was able to use 2001 individual level census data where they released an anonymized file, a 3% sample. And I was able to try and basically take account of just some simple measures of socioeconomic situation, employment status, tenure, car, etc. And I particularly made use of the idea that if there is a Scottish effect, it should particularly affect people who've lived in Scotland all their lives compared to people who've lived in England all their lives. And I didn't quite have a measure of that, but I had country of birth. So I was presuming that people born in Scotland and living in Scotland would have had the most Scottish effect, as it were. And actually, what I did find was people like myself who were born in England and have come to live in Scotland are actually a very well-off and healthy group, and probably actually much better, much healthier than people born in England and living in England overall. So we're not particularly affected by the Scottish effect. And what I found was that when you controlled for these things, that again we're using an odds ratio for the new general health question in the census, that it was reduced. So my argument was that actually once you took account of socioeconomic factors a bit more sophisticatedly perhaps, and particularly took account of differences in employment, that actually you could get rid of most of these differences. However, the big problem with all this work is that I wasn't looking at mortality, and mortality is what everybody else was interested beforehand. I was just looking at a measure of general health. Okay, so let's just return and think about mortality again. And some interesting work by David Walsh and colleagues in the Glasgow Centre for Population Health. And basically they've asked about why has Scotland got particularly poor health, and it's particularly located, in fact, in the most populous area of Scotland, in the west sort of central Scotland, which is Glasgow and the surrounding urban conurbation. And they did some very interesting work in which they contacted other statistical agencies and epidemiologists around Europe and said, well, in your country, which area has had the highest level of deindustrialization? And then, having located that, they used their partners to provide them with mortality data for those areas over time. And it was only in those sort of, in Scotland, especially in west central Scotland, of all these deindustrialised areas across a number of European countries, that we actually saw a rise in mortality rates amongst certain groups of people, especially sort of younger age males. And this was seen nowhere else in Europe. It was actually seen in some places in England as well, Liverpool, for example, but perhaps not to the degree that we were seeing in Scotland. And at the aggregate level, because that's all they had, they didn't have individual level measures, but at the aggregate level measure across these deindustrialised areas, differences in wealth and employment levels didn't seem to explain why Scotland still had such a high level of mortality. And in fact, for a deindustrialised area, Scotland was relatively wealthy. Again, however, this is an aggregate level picture. And they were sort of asking, well, what to extent is inequalities in Scotland? Have they grown larger? And is that really what's driving the Scottish effect? And that effectively comes back to an individual level explanation. Okay, so Alistair Leyland did some work on widening inequalities in Scotland. And just to quickly skip through, they found basically that there are widening differences between areas in Scotland between the least deprived and the most deprived, especially amongst the working age. In all areas in Scotland, we're being very good at decreasing heart disease and cancer. But in the most deprived, we're not so good at doing that. And also in the most deprived, for the age groups that we're effectively seeing those reductions in, we're seeing massive rises amongst those age groups in things like suicide, alcohol-related deaths especially, and drug-related deaths. So this work gives perhaps a clue to perhaps what is the Scottish effect. And I'm just going to run through a bit of this, and again this is from the Human Mortality Database, and I won't go into the measure because I just don't have time. But effectively this is a measure of inequality in the database. And again we've got Scotland at the top, the most unequal, and it's in years. And it's effectively what does the average death in a society cost a person? And for a Scottish male, it's just below 12 at the moment. And what we can see is, again, we've got our contrast countries of England, Wales, and Sweden and Norway. And basically, they've been on a downward trend, as we would expect, as life expectancy rises. But Scotland has seen this sudden breaking in its decline, and perhaps a slight upturn in its decline in inequality. Some very big rising inequalities in the distribution of death in Scotland. And I won't go into this, but effectively what this chart shows that in the later periods when we're seeing that breaking is that premature mortality the increase in premature mortality in Scotland is driving this growing inequality. So effectively, those people who are dying of by committing suicide, through alcohol-related death, or through drug misuse, are really driving this major inequality in Scotland. So Bloor and all et al. Asked this particularly interesting question around how much of the Scottish excess could be down to drug misuse. And they used estimates from an ongoing cohort study of drug users in Scotland, the Doris study, to derive estimates. And they suggest that official figures probably don't capture the true scope of drug-related deaths, particularly sort of heroin misuse, this would be. And they found that it could explain up to about a third of the excesses deaths in Scotland. However, this was only sort of age and sex-adjusted excess they were looking at rather than the deprivation excess. So it's not clear whether this is part of the way that deprivation causes the difference, or it's an extra part of the Scottish effect. So just to conclude, basically, perhaps the most likely explanation for Scotland's high mortality remains its negative socioeconomic position, though we still do see a residual difference we can't quite explain at the moment. Whether there's a distinct additional Scottish effect is not proven. But we are now, in Scotland, we have now, thanks to a number of people, the Scottish Longitudinal Study, which is an individual level cohort study of the Scottish population. And we can compare this to the similar ONS longitudinal study in England and Wales. And there's about to be a project that's going to link the two to see whether there is a Scottish effect for mortality once we can control for individual level deprivation. And that's just the acknowledgements there. Okay, thanks.
Thank you very much, Frank.
Sorry for the extremely long title slide. For those of you who don't know what the National Performance Framework, or Scotland Performs, is, you will soon. But what I'm here to talk about is the sort of change in approach in government and what opportunities and challenges that's brought for us as statisticians within government. So the big change has been a move to an outcomes-based approach. So whatever we do in government, what does it mean at the end of the day for the people of Scotland? Does it make their lives better? Does it mean that children have a better start in life? And so on. This presented quite a lot of opportunities for analysts in government, or I certainly think it did. We can bring the whole package of evidence together to say something meaningful about change in Scotland. But, you know, by no means are we there yet. It's a big culture change, and particularly in how we measure whether outcomes have been delivered. So, just to give you a bit of history, since May 2007, when the new Scottish Government came into power, there's been the Government Economic Strategy was published in November 2007, and the Spending Review document, which sort of said how they were going to implement their strategy. There was also the Concordat between the Scottish Government and local authorities and public bodies, which basically set out that we will work as partners to deliver these outcomes for the people of Scotland. And there was Scotland Performs, which is the communication tool for how we're doing against all the measures that were chosen. So this is the National Performance Framework. And I wish I had some with me, but it's basically, you know, you can present this on just two sides of paper, and it's quite a neat way of presenting the sort of priorities that the government has. So up here there's the government's purpose, which basically boils down to sustainable economic growth, although it's quite a long sentence. I can never remember it all. And there's some high-level targets which support this, including growing the population and increasing the employment rate and things like that, but also not without reducing inequalities in Scotland and also reducing carbon emissions. And then there's the 5 strategic objectives, there's a lot of numbers here, sorry. Things like smarter, healthier, and then there's 15 national outcomes, and these are things like we live longer, healthier lives, our children get the best start in life, you know. And then there's these 45 national indicators, which were chosen to be a representative set. These are not the 45 most important things the government does, but the idea is that they are a representative set. I'll just say a bit more about that in a sec. So here's a nice diagram that they've got on the Scottish Government website, and this shows how the national indicators and targets feed up to the national outcomes, which feed up to the strategic objectives, which all goes up to the purpose. Everything will drive the purpose. And apparently, I've been told by Performance Division of the Scottish Government that we're all under here, beavering away. And this is like an iceberg, apparently. So, the indicators that were chosen, the 45, I mean, obviously, the outcomes-based approach requires us to measure some outcome indicators, but also inputs and outputs to see whether we're on the track to delivering the outcomes. So there was a need to be able to measure whether we were delivering the outcome of longer, healthier lives for the people of Scotland, or the healthier strategic objectives. So these indicators were chosen to be a representative set. So when the relevant ones were taken all together, they might be able to tell us something about the outcome. However, clearly there's a massive amount of information that will need to be brought together to say anything about any one of these outcomes. But you can only have so many, and there was a desire for this to be kept quite simple. But an evaluation of the outcomes clearly will bring together all the evidence we have. So the idea is that longer, healthier lives, all of these indicators could say something about whether we're delivering it. So the important thing about the National Performance Framework is this is not linear. These indicators will say something about more than one outcome. So Scotland Performs, people get mixed up a bit between the National Performance Framework and Scotland Performs, but Scotland Performs is a communication tool. So we have all of the targets and indicators that were chosen there, and that's where we communicate the data on those indicators. This is quite a new and innovative approach, bringing it all together and presenting it and saying something about an assessment of progress. And in terms of our involvement in this as statisticians, it's a big difference to what it's been like in the past. It was based on Virginia Performs, but there are some key differences between this and Virginia Performs. Scotland Performs, the key principles of it are its transparency and that it's clear. Virginia Performs isn't very open about how they assess progress. It's more, people sit around a table and decide whether something's improving or not, whereas we publish very clearly the criteria we use to see whether things are improving. I'll say a bit more about that, but just thought I'd show you some screenshots before you rush off and go and look at scotlandperforms.com, obviously, after this. So this is Scotland Performs. Basically, it has the economic growth targets. These don't look like this now. This was a while ago. But these arrows say whether the performance is improving or worsening or maintaining. So this is the same for all of the purpose targets and all of the national indicators. And for each indicator, there's an indicator page, and under here, it's a long page. It has some policy text about why this target's important, but the bit I care about is the bit which says how are we performing. And that's all text written by analysts and statisticians in government, and it shows the trends in the data, so all of the context is there to see. There are a lot of challenges from an analytical point of view. The 45 national indicators and the purpose targets, there's a huge range of different types of data sources. There's some composite measures, which mean it's difficult to assess change, things like GDP, for example. And they're from all over the place. Some of them are within our control, but many of them are produced, by public bodies in Scotland, by ONS, and some from other UK government departments. Some are national statistics, but many are not, at least at the moment. And there's a huge range of publication timescales and data lags. And this seems to be something that we get asked about quite a lot. I wasn't expecting this to be the issue, but people are sort of asking us, when will it all be up to date? Things like that. So we've had to do quite a lot of education of both, there's been a lot of parliamentary questions on that sort of thing. So we're trying to educate members in the Parliament that when you're using data from different survey sources or different administrative systems, we always use the most up-to-date information available. But you're never going to have it all up to date for the same years at the same time, because they're just different types of data. So you've got things like problem drug users in Scotland. That's got at least a 15-month data lag in it, whereas the participation rate's published 6 weeks after the end of the quarter. So that's been a challenge in trying to educate members and ministers that it won't ever all be up to date, although it's always the most up-to-date data that we have. So, as I said before, each indicator has this arrow next to it. This is something that may change in the future. At the moment, all the arrows comment on is the change between the last two data points. This decision was taken because at the time it was launched, a lot of the information was sort of all of the baselines for the targets and things like that. And it also can be universally applied. It's just very simple. It's about the recent change. But as I say, as we move past all of the baselines for the target and build up a time series post-2007, we might need to think about how we present change. So this one's performance worsening, performance improving, and performance maintaining. And as I say, we publish on each indicator page the criteria that we use to decide whether these arrows are maintaining, worsening, or improving. And who decides that? Who decides what the criteria are, and who decides whether, given those criteria, whether an arrow should be up or down? Well, ministers were very keen that the site was analytically pure, if you like, and objective. So it's these people who make the decision, professional officers within the government. And the chief statistician is the chair of that. They make all analytical decisions to do with Scotland Performs. And this has been something that's been, people have been quite impressed with. We've had quite a lot of interest from other government departments and the Prime Minister's Delivery Unit and people in places like that. The fact that all analytical decisions, all of the arrows, all of the criteria for deciding whether performance is improving or not is made by analysts within the government. And ministers are told about the changes only to note. So we're really pleased about this, and this is one of the real powers of Scotland Performs, that all of the text there which comments on change is written by analysts the way it would be written for a statistical publication, even though Scotland Performs is obviously not a statistical publication. Each indicator page has a technical note sitting behind it, I guess, the metadata, where you can get the data, where you can get more information, what the baseline for the target is, and so on. Also on Scottish Neighbourhood Statistics, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with our special national indicator reports, so you can see the national indicators at a local level where that's available. But I guess it's important to talk about the local dimension of this, because these outcomes won't be delivered unless they're delivered at a local level first. And each of it's community planning partnerships, but basically, each of the local authorities in Scotland have compelled single outcome agreements. And what these say is how SOAs contribute to local outcome. They outline contributions to local outcomes and how these link to national outcomes. So these are our local priorities, and this is how these will feed into the national outcomes. And we set up specialist branches in OCS, Office of Chief Statistician in the Scottish Government, to support local authorities and public bodies in this work. So the key projects in there are building analytical capacity is one of them. And my colleague Sarah Granger set up a ScotStat network of analysts. And she's organised a lot of seminars and workshops to skill people up in local authorities and public bodies in various techniques, such as target setting, monitoring change, breaking down outcomes, and things like running surveys. And we've also improved the guidance quite a lot. This has been quite an eye-opener for us in the government, to sort of what level you have to go to help people who don't do this sort of thing very often understand how important thinking about things like variation in data and so on is when you're setting targets. Also, there's the Improving Local Outcome Indicators project, which does what it says on the tin, really. But we're learning a lot of lessons from it at national level as well. So it's led by Solace, but it's support from others, including public bodies. And the idea of this is to come up with a sort of menu of indicators that local authorities can use, which say something about outcomes in their area. But also it aims to improve the quality of outcome data at local level if that's what is required. So, the future challenges are how do we make this Scotland performs and not Scottish Government performs? How do we reflect contribution of public bodies and local authorities to contributing to these national outcomes? That's the next challenge for us in the Scottish Government and Scotland performs. Evaluation of outcomes, how do we know we have achieved them? And that's quite a difficult nut to crack, but that's what we're working on now. So therefore, what does success look like? So, and questions, and I'd encourage you to go and have a look at scotlandperforms.com. Thank you.
Thank you, Mairi. That's